Welcome to Chess with Link. Let's talk some more about the Caro-Kann Defense. We already talked a little bit about the basics of the Caro-Kann in my video on the classical variation. The Caro-Kann starts with white bringing out their king's pawn to e4, and then black choosing to step the c-pawn forward only one square, instead of directly opposing with a king's pawn or going all the way up to c5, as you might for a Sicilian game. Now, white is of course going to choose to bring out their d-pawn to the center. And as we discussed in that other video, they're trying to gain a stronghold on the center while opening up lines of attack for both bishops. We respond by bringing our queen's pawn forward up to d5, opening up our own light-squared bishop. But this is where the advance variation gets its name. You see, white pushes the pawn forward to e5 on their third turn. This lets white grab a little bit more of the center, kind of closing it in some. We don't have a clean way to take either of these pawns right now. And so by locking these pawns together, even though white has delayed their development, they are already starting to build a pawn chain that's going to restrict our access to their territory without blocking in their bishops. So what are we going to do here? Well, black typically brings out the light square bishop. This is in part to give pressure across the center. Now we have a threat on e4, and we are able to perhaps limit the movement of white's c-pawn because they don't want us to capture the knight in an exchange that's not really beneficial to either of us right now, but certainly not something they want to allow merely by pushing their pawn forward to complete the chain. What does white do then? In the typical path, white will then bring forward their knight to f3. This allows them to defend their d-pawn without risking the move of the c-pawn. All right. White is tightening up their position. They're restricting our access to capturing their pieces. And they're developing again. So what are we going to do? Well, even though this particular path is not always the most imaginative of paths, and some really aggressive players will choose to go other paths, this is a very principled course of action for both white to take and us to react to. Let's nudge our e-pawn forward and open up our dark bishop. This also gives our light square bishop a little bit of defense. Sure, we're restricting its ability to retreat, but we now have a nice pawn pyramid. We're keeping our position more closed, so it's hard for white to get in and attack. And we're giving ourselves some opportunities to attack behind white's pawn chain with our bishop that we moved last turn, and that we're kind of committing to by bringing this pawn forward. White brings out their e2 bishop. Why? It's a very subtle move. It does allow white to castle, though. And it prevents us from pinning their knight to the queen. Because if we step forward to threaten that knight, it's double defended by both the bishop and the pawn, and it can still move to get out of the way, revealing the attack from the e2 bishop over towards our bishop if we went for this strike, which is why we're not going to right away. So what are we going to do then? As white is beginning to develop, as they're giving themselves opportunities, let's develop as well. From this position, if we bring the queenside knight up to d7, this supports a future attack of pushing our pawn forward to c5 to put pressure at the middle or back of white's pawn chain, depending on if they ever develop that c2 pawn forward to c3. It also helps to limit white's ability to get a rapid check on us, because now, just like white having two pieces between our potential bishop position and their queen, we now have two pieces between a potential white bishop attack and our king. So what's white going to do? Castling. Castling is a safe move to make. It's a bit of a waiting move here. It's also a little bit of development, because that rook can now slide on over to the e-file to join the fight over the center. So, while it maybe looks like white is taking a very cautious approach, maybe even giving up a little bit of tempo, in a slower paced chess game, in a thoughtful chess game, this is planning for the future. So we should plan for the future as well. Now, there are several paths that black takes here. The main path that you'll see from more advanced players, and that is kind of the standard line of the advanced variation these days, is to go knight to e7. This gives us defense on both our f5 bishop and the d5 pawn. And it also allows us to potentially get our knights out to either side of the board if we decide to directly attack the king's side or loop our way around the queen's side. A couple of other options to think about. But remember, don't get overwhelmed. We're here to talk about chess from kind of a slow beginner to middle perspective. We're thinking visually and paying attention to how the pieces interact with each other. So, if you want something that's a little bit more tricky, you could push the a-pawn, but it's more of a distraction than anything that's going to be useful right away. You could also do something that is called prophylaxis. It's like a vaccine for your chess moves. And that is pull your bishop back to g6. Because if you pull that bishop back to g6, you are protecting it from potential future pressures, but it is a pretty passive move. And so that's why I say we continue with the knight to e7 path, because it gives the bishop a little bit of defense while getting both of our knights out and ready to fight. Now you'll notice that here is where I started talking about a variety of alternate paths. And that's because when you kind of like dig into the theory of openings, this is where a lot of explanations start breaking down. and individual play styles start emerging until we get to later positions on this chessboard that are a little bit more commonly recognizable. I'm talking about getting to a place that is transposed to a different style of play, perhaps. We're not going to worry about that too much, though. We're going to continue now with kind of a hybrid set of moves that I've derived from both exploring the Masters game database over on Lichess and playing around with Stockfish. And you're going to note that both the Masters and Stockfish sometimes disagree with the core opening theory that you'll sometimes see printed in books. This isn't because the books are wrong. It's because play styles evolve. Play styles change. Chess is a game, and while it is a highly analytical game that vastly rewards memorization and critical thinking, it also is a game, and it also has psychology to it. And so in computer chess, Stockfish and Leela and other engines will really look way ahead at the potential to lose pieces, the potential to get a pawn break, so many variables that humans have trouble keeping in our heads. And in master-level chess games, preferences shift over time, because professional chess players are, first and foremost, memorizing the strongest paths. But second, they're looking for ways to trick each other, to confuse each other. Chess engines tend to prefer pushing the c2 knight to c3, completing their pawn chain. That does expose their b2 knight, as we discussed previously, but that's a rather weak attack that we're probably not going to take, and engines tend to prefer development over using the same piece multiple times. All right, what about master-level chess players? Well, a little bit under half of master-level games that have this position we see on the board bring the knight from b1 to d2. This is a solid move. It is a little bit slower, though. You're activating a new piece. You're kind of mirroring the way that black is developing knights and putting pressure into the center. But it also blocks the bishop move. Our c1 bishop becomes trapped behind that knight, and the knight at d2 doesn't have terribly many places it can go right away. So I'm kind of hybridizing between the engine style of play, master level chess, and the second most popular master chess move, which we seem to find on the internet more often, which is taking that f3 knight over to h4 to put some pressure on the f5 bishop. We can go back and forth between which of these three paths is the most effective, and I'd love to see some comments down below about which one you get more success with. Especially given that black's response is to go ahead and make that move that we called prophylaxis a few moments ago. We're pulling that bishop back to a place where it is triple defended and making room for our own e7 knight to come forward, releasing the dark bishop. What are we going to do now? Well, white goes ahead and brings their knight out. In this way, they are developing the knight, just like master level players typically do, but they're getting pressure into our territory first, trying to regain a little bit of tempo and put black on the back foot. So what are we going to do in response? Well, what have we been threatening? What have we been threatening to do for most of the game? And we even moved our knight to support it earlier. From here, a little bit over half of high-level players choose to go for the pawn break. They push that c6 pawn forward to c5, trying to gain more control of the center. Even if we lose that pawn to our opponent's pawn, we have a knight ready to step in and fight. Now, white knows that we are ready to fight over the center, and that's why from here we typically see the c2 pawn forward to complete the chain at c3. You can see we're in that same position that we talked about a couple turns back. We have moved the c3 pawn, and we have moved the knight. We have moved the pawn to c3, we have moved the knight to d2, and we have some additional pressure coming in here from the side of the board. We're trying to transpose into this position where we've got all of the pieces that we were hoping to move. It's perhaps a little bit of a hybrid style of play, but it does have the advantage of letting us complete the pawn chain without putting our knight in danger, while activating an additional knight, maybe at the cost of slowing down our dark bishop. Speaking of dark bishops, this is when we're going to go ahead and bring our own knight forward. This will both block the white pawn from advancing further if they capture on c5, and it opens up our dark square bishop only up to c5, but it does perhaps let us bring that bishop up to e7 to get a little bit of pressure, or after the exchanges happen in the middle of the board, the bishop could go further up to get some even better pressure. So what will white do now? Well, the only game in the Lichess Master database that got to this position saw the knight attack, capturing our bishop. And now we take back, opening up the h-file. I'm excited to see how this works for you, and I'll certainly be practicing it over the next few weeks myself. And if you have any comments about how this opening works for you on the chessboard, or why higher level players tend to choose a little bit of a slower path, a little bit of a cautious knight development, and this powerful interlocking closed position of pawns for both sides of the board, I'd sure love to read about them down in the comments. So have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you on the chessboard.